After last week's virtual meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden, hopes of warming bilateral relations are higher than before. But on Tuesday, the U.S. sent another warship through the Taiwan Straits. The sailing of the USS Milius is part of what Washington calls routine activity. China condemned such moves and warned there will be no compromise on issues related to China's core interests, especially Taiwan affairs. Some say it seems the icebreaker in China-U.S. tensions is short-lived, but many wonder if it is. So could China and the U.S. really build common-sense guardrails in bilateral relations from last week's virtual meeting? And what is the bottom line between the two countries? Former Chinese Defense Ministry official Senior Colonel Zhou Bo in a latest exclusive interview. Senior Colonel Zhou, I would love to have your takeaway of the latest development regarding the two presidents' virtual meeting. Common sense guardrails, that's a phrase being used.
I like this idea of a common sense guardrail because guardrail itself suggests that this relationship is volatile and it might go beyond the guardrail into conflict or any other situations that nobody wants. But the question is, how effective can guardrails be, and in what areas should we have guardrails? My background was in the military, and this actually is the biggest concern of two sides, not to have a military conflict. In Biden's words, a conflict intended or unintended. But if we look at the current situation, I would say that the good wish is not really in line with the real situation. For example, I think President Biden has mentioned the competition as stiff competition, straightforward competition, or extreme competition. And he also mentioned that we don't want a conflict. But the question is, if the competition is already extreme, how far is it away from a conflict? If you do not want a conflict, why don't you stay back and stay away from such extreme competition? And logically, it's a cooperation that leads to a better relationship. It's not extreme competition.
May I just ask more about the competition? Of
Yes.
course, it's already well known to the rest of the world that China does not like that word competition in terms of how to define China-U.S. relations. However, when you have one side of the relationship believing it is the nature, while the other side of it do not want to subscribe to it, that's already a competition of ideas, isn't it?
Yeah, it just depends on how you look at this issue. It's just like a glass half full with water. Whether it is half empty or whether it's half filled tells more about you rather than the glass. Admittedly, there is an element of both in this relationship, but I hope cooperation might prevail over competition, and in the worst case, competition do not slide into confrontation.
It seems that there is more competition between the two militaries.
Militarily, yeah, this relationship is intrinsically competitive. I think this applies to all the military relationship. When we come to China-U.S. military relationship, I would say there is something in common, that is, neither side wants a conflict. Yeah, but the reality is all American ships sail in China's water, and all American aircraft would fly in China's exclusive economic zone, and it's not the other way around. Therefore, the challenge is PLA actually is getting stronger and stronger. Mm-hmm. And could PLA bear with such kind of provocative activities that are intrinsically detrimental to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity? Yeah? So if you do not want the water to boil, so why would you throw wood into the fire?
People argue about whether that is international water, and also argue about whether that is really China's economic flight zone. So tell me more about, once again, it seems to be a competition of ideas, competition of definition.
From China's point of view, we have all the historical evidence whatsoever to consider that this is Chinese water and this is China's just airspace. But of course, there are some other arguments. Then, if we have disagreement, how should we resolve this? We have to talk about this rather than challenging unilaterally. And this is extremely ridiculous on American side, since it has not ratified UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, but it believes that it is the own guardian of the international law. Actually, from 2019 to 2020, it has challenged the so-called excessive maritime claim of 19 countries. But who authorized you to challenge these countries? And this is just like you are not a club member, but you are talking about other club members violating the rules of the club.
It seems that the only thing left is the bottom line. Two presidents, when they met, the phrase of common sense guardrails were being used. That was, in a way, talking about the bottom line. Where are the common sense guardrails? If we don't have them, do you see the hope that the two mills, military to military, are eager and willing to implement the leaders' directions?
Well, currently, the rules in place are mostly tactical arrangements that can hardly resolve strategic mistrust. Because if we talk about the rules of behaviors between the two countries, either at sea or in air, they are just for unplanned encounters. But the question is, American aircraft or ships come planned. They just come planned to challenge you. So this is a totally different situation. Therefore, we must first of all have a kind of a strategic agreement. This is not achieved so far. So that is a problem between all the talks in the last 2 to 3 decades. You know, I would say these talks are always useful, but they're really not so fruitful. Because, Chinese would say, you should not come. Whether you come or not, this is a strategic issue. But Americans say, of course I would come, but you have to make sure that we are safe. So that means Americans is actually practicing a kind of a brinkmanship while asking you to keep a safe distance. This is difficult. So then what kind of a strategic trust we should have?
So you are saying the status quo right now, if I could use that word, stretch a little bit that word, is not going to be maintainable.
I think it's very hard to maintain, especially the competition between the two countries is ever intensifying. So what is my hope? My best hope is one very simple term borrowed from the Cold War. During the Cold War, we talk about mutually assured destructions because of the almost equal number of nuclear weapons on both sides. Now, between China and the US, we should talk about mutually assured coexistence.
So you're saying we're coming into the Cold War, real sense?
No, it's not quite, because when I talk about the mutually assured coexistence, this would be totally different from mutually assured destruction. And I think coexistence is entirely possible. Why? Because if you look at the problem between China and US, we only have disagreements in China's periphery. And elsewhere in the whole world, there is no need for PLA to come into a clash with the US military. We do not have such ambition to police the world, right? So it is entirely possible. So we only have the problem in our periphery. And to some extent, this situation, I would say, is more dangerous than during the Cold War. Why? Because during the Cold War, this kind of a balance of terror would make each side unwilling to challenge the other. But now, we do not have even buffer zone between us, because they would regularly sail through Taiwan Straits or the waters of China's Rockies and islands. So this kind of situation is more dangerous. So that is why we need to ensure mutually assured coexistence. And this is more possible, in my opinion, after 2030. Why? Because around 2030, or even before that, almost all economists agree that China's economy will surpass that of the United States to become the largest economy in the world. I assume maybe by that time, the United States would consider, well, this is not a country that we can really challenge or prevail over, so let's coexist.
Senior Colonel Zhou, once again, I want to come back to the two presidents' meeting. They do suggest that there should be dialogues and discussions established as a result of that. What do you think is the momentum for the Chinese side, for example, to be able to come into that discussion?
We are not short of dialogues. The only question is, unless and until you do have intention to coexist with the other side and to resolve problems through negotiations, such kind of dialogues are less meaningful than they should. That is a problem.
But now situations are getting ever more intense over the issue of Taiwan, for example. There's, of course, political provocation from one side about that. There's also willingness among some forces on the island trying to go along. So, Senior Colonel Zhou, how do you see what you discussed as useful but not fruitful? How is that going to be reflected on the issue of Taiwan in terms of how the two militaries, China and the U.S., to make sure not to involve themselves into a real conflict?
Well, I think the Taiwan issue is totally different from what
How come?
Yeah, well, I think because the nature is different. Well, on the South China Sea issues, American ships would come, to sail in the name of freedom of navigation. But, on Taiwan issue, it's a question of sovereignty. And American agrees that Taiwan being part of China, although what really China would be, that is a bigger question. But what we have seen is the changes from Trump administration. I believe they are just a salami cutting on the so-called One China pledge. We have seen all this, right? Because recently the Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen has actually admitted that there have been American servicemen training Taiwanese. We didn't know that before. And the former American Secretary of State Pompeo actually has scrapped all the legal restrictions in terms of American exchanges with Taiwan to make the situation as difficult as possible for Joe Biden. Biden's policy is very much a follow-up of Trump's great power rivalry, I assume, because if you look at what they said, and even if you look at what they are doing, and even if you are looking at Biden's invitation to Taiwan to join the so-called Summit of Democracy, that means Americans' policy toward Taiwan really hasn't changed much. And of course, this is a core issue for China. We just cannot let it go by idly.
Senior Colonel Zhou, I'm sure you have noticed many times that when Chinese leaders these days give speeches at international occasions, they repeatedly mention that China does not subscribe to small groups, but rather China subscribes to real multilateralism. And that's a term almost being said, real multilateralism. What is China's understanding of the real multilateralism in a way? And how do you see that vis-a-vis what's going on right now? For example, about the Indo-Pacific, the AUKUS, that's one example, another Quad, for example. How do you see these different concepts?
I believe AUKUS is against China, and the Quad is because of China. But none of them would really work against China. Why? Because AUKUS is a military, is a kind of a coalition among allies. But if indeed the first submarine of around 8 nuclear-powered submarines would only come into production by 2040, that doesn't matter tremendously toward China. Although it might complicate our decision-making. Yes, in a way, that is true, but it won't be a big game changer. But Quad is different. Quad could be anything other than a military coalition, as some people have suspected. No, I don't think so. Why? Because basically the focus of Quad would be in the Indian Ocean. Yeah, because in the Pacific they already have AUKUS. So in the Indian Ocean, the focus is where Quad is. But in the Indian Ocean, the PLA has no confrontation whatsoever with any other countries. Why? Because the PLA's military operations overseas are all humanitarian in nature. So, and the international sea lanes is free for everyone. And what's more, a stronger Chinese PLA will be able to show the more responsibilities in protecting these vital sea lanes, which is critically important for China. So Quad could develop in many different directions. We don't know about its future. And it's developing fast, frankly speaking, but it cannot be a useful military coalition against China.
How do you see the role of the militaries these days in this dramatic change?
More or less all the militaries in the world have the same role if it comes to territorial defense. That is the same. But for China, or for any major powers, there are two more things. One is your overseas interest. Another is your international responsibilities. As a major power, you should not only take care of yourself, you should also take care of the well-being of other countries. And that's exactly what we have been trying to do. And for example, in counterparts in the Gulf of Aden, out of the 7,000 ships also that we have protected, half of them are foreign ships. And remember, this is not the mission designed initially. Initially, we only mean to protect Chinese ships and Chinese seafarers and to escort the ships of World Food Program. So this mission of protecting foreign ships is totally unexpected, because when you are protecting Chinese ships, other foreign ships would just follow these Chinese ships, and you just cannot drive them away to say that we only protect Chinese ships, because this is humanitarian obligations for China. So we just did it, and we're still doing it.